My name is Bess Vincent, and on behalf of the Cultural Arts Center, the Education and Social Sciences departments of Montgomery College, the Women and Gender Studies program, and the Office of Student Life, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending. I have a few practical notes before we begin the program this evening. First, if you would be so kind as to silence your cell phones, that would be greatly appreciated. If you're a student who may need a certificate of attendance for being here this evening, they'll be available at the exits after the talk. For faculty and staff who may be attending and wish to receive the Multicultural Diversity Training Certificate, these forms are available at the table out in the front, and you can pick one up on your way out. I would also like to acknowledge the hard work of the women and gender advocates and IPSA student organization members who volunteered their time to support today's event. Both groups are doing wonderful things here on campus, and these organizations are really shaping the culture of this campus in profound ways. I'm glad to have their support and look forward to seeing what else these groups accomplish. As many of you know, the topics of sexual assaults on campus is never too far from the news. Unfortunately, such incidents are all too common. Often, the perpetrators are described as fraternity members or college athletes, while the victims are young, vulnerable women. And since this sort of arrangement, where men are the offenders and women are the victims, is a dominant narrative in the sexual assault stories that receive public attention, it can be hard to envision men as empathizers and allies in efforts to control and deter sexual assault. Our presenter today will address such issues. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Kristen Barber with us here today. Dr. Barber received her Ph.D. from University of Southern California and joined the Southern Illinois University faculty in 2011. Her two primary areas of interest include the social construction of gender and methodological and epistemological developments in qualitative and feminist research. Dr. Barber has published many peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, including 2 publications related to her presentation here today, which is titled Men at the March: Gender and Protest Participation in Anti-Sexual Assault Events. Scholars and activists have long debated whether and how to include men in feminism. As organizers embrace an inclusive logic for who can participate, these questions have become key fault lines in feminist events, such as this anti-sexual assault march's Take Back the Night and Slut Walk. Dr. Barber discusses how the question to ask is not should men participate, but how they can participate to support the goals of these events. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have some representatives from VASAP, the Victim Assistance and Sexual Assault Program. Did they make their way into the theater? They have a table out in the front, and you can stop and look at some of their materials. They have a partnership here with Montgomery College. So I would encourage you to take a look at their information, and you can do so. And for now, though, Dr. Barber.
Hello, and thank you, Dr. Vincent, for that kind introduction. In 2011, a Toronto police chief, Michael Sanguinetti, was talking to a law school at York University. He was talking about safety and how to mitigate safety for women on the streets. And he told a college audience that if women wanted to avoid being victims of sexual assault, that they should avoid dressing like sluts. Ooh is right. All right, so protests erupted around Sanguinetti's remarks, giving way to the first slut walk. On the Slut Walk's webpage, the original organizers described the march as a way to reclaim the word slut as a particularly pervasive and insidious form of victim blaming that shames the survivor while making assumptions about their sexuality. So on April 3rd, 2011, we saw organizers in Toronto protest the victim blaming that undergirded Sanguinetti's remarks. And what was particularly problematic was that these remarks were coming from a policing officer, right? Somebody who's embedded within an institution that is supposed to protect women from becoming victims of sexual assault and mitigate the experiences of victims in their homes and on the streets. So the slut walk brought to our attention the issue of reclaiming the word slut. It really encouraged, especially young women, college students, to come out onto the streets and draw attention to the fact that cultural rules around women's bodies have served to control women on a global scale and throughout history. Okay, the slut walk really highlighted the idea that women are not raped because of what they wear. Right? So women aren't really raped because they're dressed like sluts, right? Or whatever that's supposed to mean. They're sexually assaulted while wearing jeans. They're sexually assaulted while wearing baggy sweatshirts. So dress is really not the issue. The slut walk also highlighted the idea that women do have a right to sexual expression. So what if they wear mini skirts and tube tops and fishnets and high heels, right? So what if they go out in public in something that resembles a corset, right? The idea that women are asking for negative attention, that they're asking for somebody to make remarks about their bodies or physically assault them in some way, really rests on the idea that women's bodies do not belong to them. Okay, it rests on the idea that men are entitled to women's bodies and that women are heterosexually available feminine objects before they are whole persons with subjectivity and agency. And finally, the slut walk highlighted that women should be free from violence by men and that violence is perpetrated by men. Okay, so what often happens is that when we perpetuate victim-blaming rhetoric, right? Well, if women just didn't walk, on the streets at night, if they just didn't walk alone, if they just, wore appropriate clothing, what happens is that we evoke a passive voice, right? We evoke this idea that the conversation should be only about women, okay? But if women are sexually assaulted, by whom, okay? And so feminist scholars and activists that are interested in the issue of sexual assault are really becoming more and more interested in challenging the passive voice that sort of circulates around discussions of women's experiences of sexual assault. Okay, by whom? Women tend to be sexually assaulted by men. Okay, but the problem is that men have a very sort of reactive response to bringing men into the discussion, okay? It becomes very personal for men and oftentimes sort of undergirds this backlash against feminist discourses of sexual assault, okay? So are you calling me a rapist? And what these marches do, what anti-sexual assault events do, is highlight structural issues rather than individual problems with individual men. Okay, so it's important to note that Sanguinetti did come out. He made a public apology, and an issue of the Toronto Excalibur, a local newspaper, there was an article entitled "Cops Slut Comment Draws Backlash from Guerrilla Activists." Now, I take some issue with the term guerrilla activists because it suggests that the women, largely women organizing these events, are somehow radical, somehow doing something that is so radical that it's difficult to understand. These are guerrilla activists, okay? And his comment was, his apology was, I made a comment which was poorly thought out. Violent crimes such as sexual assault can have a traumatizing effect on their victims. And of course, he should apologize. His remarks were very offensive. However, what ends up happening is that these sorts of holding a single person accountable and these sorts of apologies really reinforces this idea of the one bad apple problem. Okay, that it's just one bad apple, that it's just one asshole making these comments, okay? But if we removed Sanguinetti from the police force, it's likely that other people would continue to talk or think in this way, okay? It's very culturally embedded, okay? We see, scholars talk about this issue of a rape culture, okay, where we can see in music videos, where we can see in advertising campaigns, the ways in which women are positioned or represented as sexually subordinate and desirable, sexually desirable objects before they are full people. Okay, so in the West, we have an increasing investment in the idea of individualism, okay? That this is obviously a comment made by one person, and it's a problem and it represents a personality flaw. But I really want to focus this talk on the idea that this sort of rhetoric occurs on a larger cultural level that seeps into our everyday interactions, but that are also institutionalized in spaces like the police force and on a global scale. So what was so interesting about the Slut Walk was that it was organized largely through social media. Okay, so it happened fast and it spread like wildfire. And it didn't just happen or take place in Toronto or New York or LA or DC. It took place in Carbondale, Illinois, small town America. Right, students, largely students, were organizing slut walks by the dozen. And they also took place across the globe in places like Bangalore, okay, and Hong Kong. But they look different in these places. And my colleague, Kelsey Kretschmer, who's a sociologist as well, and in the department at SIU with me, we have plans to work on a paper that compares these marches across nations. But what we saw in places like Bangalore were men marching for women. And I don't mean, in support of women so much as I do in place of women. Okay, they weren't marching physically alongside women because it wasn't safe for women to do so. Women couldn't take to the streets to protest these ideas. Okay, so these were men-only slut walks, which I think is particularly interesting. So today I'm going to talk about men. I don't want to use the passive voice, and I'm going to talk about men as perpetrators of sexual assault, but also as potential allies to combat domestic violence and sexual assault against women. Okay, we became very interested in the idea of the slut walk and men's participation by going to our own local slut walk, okay, where people were dressed in very provocative clothing, and I should go back real quickly, where they were holding signs that say, "Honk if you heart sluts," "I borrowed this outfit from your mom, do you still want to rape me?" Okay, don't teach us how to dress, teach men, don't rape. Okay, and we were very interested in the fact that these were sort of glittery, fun, carnival-esque protests, something we hadn't really been as familiar with. Things like marches like the Take Back the Night tend to be very solemn, somber events. They tend to be vigils where people share their, bravely share their experiences of sexual assault. But at the Slut Walk, there were sorts of participation that suggested open boundaries. There were no rules, okay? The only rule is that you show up, okay? A slut walk's going to happen. These are the messages that we want to convey. Come one, come all, and participate as you like. Okay, so as these sorts of anti-sexual assault events have emerged, feminist organizers and activists began debating whether men can be feminists, if they should participate in feminist protest, and the consequences of men's participation to the feminist goals of raising awareness about larger structural relations that privilege men at the expense of women. So could they, should they? All right. For decades, feminist scholars and activists have debated the man question in feminism. Okay, and this is not my term. This is something that has circulated. This is generally the idea of how do we incorporate men as allies when they're also perpetrators. That is, men as a group as the problem, but also potentially allies to resolve the problem. Scholar David Kahane says, fighting patriarchy means fighting themselves. Okay, so we're really interested in this idea of feminist logics around separatism and inclusion shaping the way that these marches look and the way that these marches look different. So organizers of feminist anti-sexual assault events have to make choices about whether to include or exclude men. And as I discussed, these are choices that are rooted historically in socio-historical politics around the development of a feminist consciousness via separatism in the 1960s and 1970s, and then a backlash against feminism in the 1990s. So we ask, under what conditions are men incorporated into or excluded from feminist events? That is, we're not just interested in, our opinions. We're not just interested in sort of sitting down and debating this. We want to look at how are men participating and what are the consequences of their participation. So to do this, we have been looking, doing archival research where we look at newspaper coverage of slut walks and Take Back the Night from the 1980s onward. And we specifically focus on those articles that, in which the reporters interview men. Okay, so in the 1960s and 1970s, when we have what has been often called the second wave of feminism, activists become largely invest in this idea of separatism. That is, that you cannot sort of dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, okay? That women have to create spaces that are women-only spaces. Because if men are part of this space, women might not be feel as free to share their experiences of things like sexual assault. So there was this idea in the 60s and 70s that women needed to create a feminist consciousness. They needed to develop a feminist consciousness, okay? They needed to understand that their individual experiences of sexual assault connect them to other women, okay? That this is a phenomenon that hugely impacts women's lives, whether they experience sexual assault or live their lives with the threat of sexual assault. And so the idea was that through women's groups where women would get together, literally get together, sit around and talk, that women could understand that as women they had shared experiences and that as a collective they could organize to bring attention to these issues. So feminist scholar Sandra Bartke says the discoveries we made, she's talking about the 60s and 70s, the discoveries we made about the nature and extent of our sometimes blatant but often disguised oppression could not and would not have been made in the presence of the oppressor. So, and it was during this time that Take Back the Night emerged. Okay, it was during this sort of cultural milieu when sexual assault and rape weren't taken seriously. Rape wasn't considered necessarily an important crime. Women who were married couldn't technically be raped, right? And instead it was often a joke. It was often seen as a male accomplishment. Okay, it wasn't problematized the way it is today. So it's important to understand that this is when Take Back the Night emerged, and this is partly why Take Back the Night emerged as largely and most often a separatist event that only included women. So here's an example of a 1979 Take Back the Night march in Milwaukee, and I believe there were over 2,500 people marching in the event. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what it looked like early on. Okay. Slut Walk emerges in 2011, a very recent event that looks much different than Take Back the Night. And this is why we're interested in comparing the two. Okay, so as the political and cultural climate in the United States shifted rightward and grew increasingly hostile to feminism in the 1980s and the 1990s, feminists faced difficult choices about how closed their movements and their events should be. They were seeking new allies, and so they shifted away from separatism and expanded movement boundaries for who could count as feminist as well as who could benefit from feminism, right? So to appeal to men, to encourage men to sort of uptake this feminist identity and participate in feminist events, organizers have been trying to appeal to men by highlighting their costs, okay? The idea that men suffer costs because of patriarchy, right? So if we define masculinity as unemotional, right, or emotionally removed, right? This idea that men grow up with their parents telling them, you know, don't cry, boys don't cry, be a man, right? That this is part of the gender order, okay? That men are encouraged to show aggression, that we don't necessarily consider aggression an emotion, okay? Instead, they're seen as somehow less emotional than women, essentializing differences between men and women. However, what ends up happening is that to appeal to men, we highlight costs, okay? So we might say something like, these sorts of definitions of masculinity inhibit men from developing close relationships with one another, okay? From developing intimate relationships with one another, right? So, you know, women might be able to show more emotion and care towards another woman, but not necessarily because women are naturally more nurturing, but because men are discouraged from doing so. So if we use costs of patriarchy to encourage men to participate in these events, we end up bringing men's issues into the fold. And what a lot of scholars argue is that this ends up displacing women's narratives and women's experiences. Okay. Excuse me. So as a backlash against feminism and a particular kind of separatist feminism really emerges and takes a foothold within organizing around feminist issues, young women in particular tend to focus on this idea of inclusion or inclusivity and argues that people occupy multiple social locations. That is, how can we expect women to come together as a collective and assume that women have shared experiences if they're also divided along the lines of race and ethnicity and sexuality and class and immigration status, okay? So what we might call third wave feminists are really interested in this idea that women might suffer costs, or I should say, oppression or subordination because of gender inequality, but they do so differently, okay? So this is the idea that white women, white middle-class women, might have racial privilege, right? They might experience things and experience the world differently than black women, let's say. So the idea was, let's create more inclusivity in our movements, okay? In the 1960s and 1970s, feminist movement was really criticized for upholding the issues of white middle-class women. So from this sort of intersectional and inclusive perspective, organizers begin to refuse to draw lines and enforce boundaries in their protests. And by bringing men in, they are interested in this idea that Michael Flood notes. He says that transforming men's attitudes, behaviors, and social relationships in which they engage is vital to building gender equality, right? So the idea that we have to engage men, that if we don't engage men in conversations about feminism, engage men in conversations about sexual assault against women, then we overlook half of the population. If we're to enact real change, we need to broaden the conversation. So this is the cultural milieu in which the slut walk emerges. Okay, so you can see that the slut walk, I love this photo from a Melbourne photographer. of the Slut Walk in 2014. Right, that highlights this greater willingness to include sex positivity, reclaimed slut as an empowering term, and refuse to police gender and sexual expression. So as a result, you have, transgender participants, you have, men in drag, you have men discussing their own victimization, right? The conversation broadens. We'll talk about how this is a positive and sometimes a negative. Okay, so I already mentioned, I won't talk too much about it, but I've already mentioned the fact that we're really interested in the media, right? We're looking at news articles because feminist organizers of these sorts of events are not interested in having their messages isolated, okay? Participating in something like the vigil tonight is very important to survivors, right? It's important and it's difficult and it's courageous to tell your stories of sexual assault. It can be very cathartic for people, but it's also an educational opportunity, right? To let people know that this happens, that women are sexually assaulted on a huge scale, right? We know that about 1 in 4 women experience sexual assault, and in places like college campuses and the military, this occurs at a larger rate. Okay, so if we don't want to keep our messages isolated, right? We don't want this discussion not to move beyond the vigil tonight. We need to appeal to news sources, okay? And so the role of the media is very important. It validates the movement's importance and carries messages to a broader audience. So we found 5 ways, five ways in which men participate in these events. And now, of course, we're using newspaper data, so there's a selection bias here. Reporters, there might be other ways men participate that the reporters aren't discussing. But as far as what's being picked up in the news, there are 5 main ways that men's participation is highlighted. I call the first marching for mothers. Okay, this idea that men are sympathizers or allies, right? That when you talk to a lot of men at these marches, they'll say things like, I'm here to support my sister, my girlfriend, a woman friend of mine, my mother, either because they're women who experience threats to their bodily harm, threats of bodily harm on a daily basis, or because they have actually experienced sexual assault. So they're there to support the women in their lives. They say things like, I feel good about this. I was raised by a single mother and I have a sister, so I feel like I'm fighting for them in a sense. Okay, and in Tampa, Florida, youth pastor Greg Stevens organized this event. And the reporter said that he did so because his sister killed herself after being raped and hiding the fact out of shame. And he said that she knew people would label her a slut. Okay, so this idea that sexual assault causes real mental, emotional anguish. So organizers respond to this sort of participation, not so much at Slut Walk, where there are open boundaries and men are encouraged to participate in any which way, but Take Back the Night, where organizers have historically struggled with this idea of including men. I want to read a quote. One organizer told the media, "Many men will say they are concerned about violence because it could happen to my wife or daughter or sister." And as genuine as this feeling is, the theme of these marches is that every woman, even a mini-skirted prostitute getting into a man's car on the streets of Toronto, has an equal right to be free of violence. The notion that some women are more worthy than others depending on what they wear, how they behave, and where they walk has been the basis of a lot of victim blaming in our society. Okay, so this concern amongst some organizers that participating in these events for a particular individual reduces the conversation to particular individuals rather than suggesting this is a problem that all women experience. Okay, so organizers want people to come and want men to come to march, not just for their mothers and their sisters and their wives and their girlfriends, okay, but they want them to march for all women. They want them to march for the mini-skirted prostitute getting into a man's car on the street, right, and not blame her for her own experiences of sexual assault, right? Well, if she didn't get into that car, if she just didn't wear that, if she just wasn't a prostitute, okay, she's inviting this. Okay, but again, this takes out of the equation the perpetrator. It encourages a passive voice around discussions around sexual assault. Secondly, men too. I was going to title this Me Too. Okay, this idea that men often marched as victims themselves, right? Men experience sexual assault. And this is particularly the place, this particularly happens in places like the military, okay? And there's been a lot of discussion in the news lately about sexual assault in the military, not just as experienced by women, but experienced by men. And this is also the case in fraternities as part of the hazing process, okay? Men might be asked to do things that are very uncomfortable for them. And so men come to these marches because they want to say, me too, okay? Men are also victimized. One marcher at the Slut Walk said, I was wearing khaki shorts. Another said, just because I'm dressed in torn up jeans doesn't mean you can hurt me. Now, of course, they're not really marching in a way that supports the Slut Walk's main message, right? Which is that I should be able to dress however I want, okay? Victim blaming around issues of promiscuity or the appearance of promiscuity doesn't really haunt men like it does women, okay? So the exclusive nature of Take Back the Night meant that these sorts of people weren't generally included. And when they did show up, they simultaneously engaged issues of exclusivity and victimhood, okay? They didn't just show up and say, I have also been victimized, but they said, I have also been victimized, and why the hell are you excluding me? Okay, if you are excluding me, then this is obviously an example of reverse discrimination and shame on you. Okay, so the family of one young man who was sexually assaulted and killed showed up in the Virgin Islands. She said, I'm marching for men who are overlooked as victims of domestic assault. So how do organizers respond to this? And we saw a real shift in the 1990s and on articles, okay, after the sort of surgence of inclusive feminist logics. And in Wilmington, North Carolina, Take Back the Night became rebranded as Breaking the Silence, okay, and to communicate that sexual assault happens to men as well. So men's participation as victims acknowledges assault of men, but scholars also say that it overlooks the differences in frequency, severity, and purpose between men and women's experiences of sexual assault. Okay, so to, take problem with the fact that for 1 hour, 1 day out of the year, women go to the streets during a Take Back the Night event and reclaim public space as a safe space. And to say that that's a problem and an affront to me as a man and an example of reverse discrimination, what it ends up doing is it ends up marginalizing or decentralizing women's voices, okay? Yes, sexual assault is a gendered phenomenon. And this means, one, that women experience sexual assault at a huge level, at a larger level than men, and this does not mean that men's experiences of sexual assault are not horrific, okay? But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at how women in the United States experience sexual assault and how women globally experience and are controlled via sexual assault. But also, it supports this idea that that men not only experience it at the same frequency, but for the same purpose and by the same people, okay? So it's a gendered phenomenon also in the sense that men are often the perpetrators of women and of men, right? So when men experience sexual assault, it's often at the hand of other men. And sociologists aren't really interested in saying, okay, men, right, what's wrong with you? Psychologically, what's going on? We're more interested in asking what culturally, okay, is going on. You know, what are the dialogues in our cultures that really shape men and women's behaviors and shape a culture where entitlement by men of women and women's bodies is okay? And this is, you know, I think increasingly getting a lot of attention because of social media, right? So the sexual assault of women, right, is being videotaped by phone. There was a Penn State incident where, right, women were passing out at parties and men were taking off their clothes and taking pictures of them and posting them on Facebook, right? So, you know, these things have been happening, but it's only now that they've become so public that we're really beginning to have a real conversation about them. Okay. We also saw that men were what we call co-opting protests, that they were dressing in drag as superheroes and, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, and in Boston, organizing a pimp walk. Has anybody heard about the pimp walk? At first, it was a threat. The idea that a slut walk was coming to Boston garnered a lot of backlash, and there were men who were claiming, well, then I'm going to have a pimp walk, right? If you're going to take this space over and march down the street saying that you have rights, well, then I have freedom of speech and I can have a pimp walk, okay? So what's great about inclusivity is that you have a lot of genderqueer, a lot of drag at these events, and they can be real spaces for people who don't identify as heteronormative to carve out space to have dialogues about the assault to transgender people, for example, okay, and the rate at which they experience hostility on the streets. But what also happens is that a bunch of fraternity members come dressed in drag, okay? So how helpful is this to the message, right? That's the question. That's the empirical question. Men also came dressed as superheroes. There were men at one particular slut walk who came dressed as Superman, right? This idea, really invoking this idea that men can be saviors to women, right? That I'm going to save women, I'm going to support women, right? But the idea, of course, of these sorts of events are that women should not need men to be saviors, right? They should move around the world with freedom, right? They should be free of sexual assault. And then men also, a lot of them told us, I'm here to see the sluts, right? I'm here to see attractive women in very little clothing. They had signs that said things like, I love sluts, Trojan field tester right here, and National Go Topless Day. And the organizers of the pimp walk told reporters that, you know, I don't mean any offense, right? It's just a joke. You know, we're really here to get some numbers. You're welcome, right? For attracting people to your march and to talk to attractive women. Of course, these men who participated in the pimp walk were confronted by marchers who had issues with the presence of men as pimps, right, as symbols of women's sexual subordination, right? That's who pimps are. But the irony seemed really lost on these men, okay, that at a march where women were, you know, fighting, you know, ideas and experiences of sexual assault, that men would come dressed as symbols of women's sexual subordination. Yeah. So a really great image from the slut walk in Amsterdam, 2011. Just to kind of give you an idea of, you know, what narratives about inclusivity can do. They can do wonderful things, right? They can do things like, you know, bringing in drag queens. But then this guy over here on your left probably isn't a drag queen, right? So he's really co-opting images of feminized sexuality and hitting the streets in drag, but you have to wonder how helpful, right, this sort of participation is. The question is it upholding the messages of the event? Okay, Raymond Connell says, don't forget, the backlash is not the only show in town, okay? Men aren't just participating in ways that are maybe somewhat helpful, probably problematic, but they're also participating in ways that really encourage a discussion and a challenging of gender as a larger structure, okay? They are challenging popular ideas of what it means to be a man, okay? Valorized ideas of masculinity that connect masculinity to aggression, to heterosexual prowess. So I wanted to highlight 3 ways in which these sorts of men participate. They participate to take into consideration structure, where they critically engage privilege and definitions of masculinity as a systematic problem, okay? Where they say, yes, our cultural definitions of masculinity and as men as dominant over women, as stronger than women, as having rights to women's bodies, right? Where masculine value comes with how many notches you have on your belt, right? Is a problem, and that these sorts of definitions of masculinity underpin and have something to do with the sexual assault of women. They also engage symbols. They challenge the image of John Wayne, right? The very stoic, unemotional image of masculinity, right? And people will go back and look at John Wayne movies, right? Who was considered like the man, right? He was an idyllic man, idyllic representation of masculinity. And in a lot of his movies, right, he's grabbing the woman's wrist and, pulling her around and swinging her against the wall and kissing her and ripping her clothes off. And then, you can imagine what happens next, right? Very sort of hostile, aggressive displays of heterosexual masculinity in ways that have been fetishized culturally. And of course, these sorts of men are participating in interactions that are affecting change. And by that I mean that they're not just talking the talk, they're literally walking the walk, okay? Oops. And finally, we found that, especially at Take Back the Night, men were participating in supportive roles. That is, younger women or younger feminists, there's a backlash against feminism, not all of these young women identify as feminists, are pressured to include men, right? They're, pressure to rebut this idea that they're participating in reverse discrimination. So what they end up doing is they end up structuring the march in ways that create limited or controlled participation for men. They say, okay, listen, Take Back the Night is about women. It's about raising, awareness around women's experiences of sexual assault. So you can stand on the sidelines with your candles while the women walk by, okay, in silence, supporting the women. In some instances, they say, okay, what would be really helpful is if you provided child care to free women up to participate in these sorts of events, okay? Maybe, you can serve refreshments afterwards, so where you're not actually participating in the event, but you're there afterwards to greet the women, to serve them refreshments. Okay, and then in some cases, organizers are creating separate events for men so that after the march, men can come, they can feel included and be included, but in a way where men lead men-only discussions of patriarchy and sexual violence. So this idea of trying to create safe spaces in which men might feel free to be vulnerable and to say, I don't necessarily agree with these ideas. These have been my own experiences. And what's interesting about limited and controlled participation, which did not happen in the slut walk, right? Open boundaries, but happened at Take Back the Night, is that when reporters interviewed men, they said things like, this event is about women taking back the streets without being escorted. This is not our march, Okay, so the question is, how effective are these sorts of controlling mechanisms for creating an event that really supports, gets men and women invested in a way that supports a larger message? Now, organizers end up having to defend their exclusive or separatist organizing strategies, right? So if you say, oh, this is reverse discrimination, reporters think that that's very interesting, okay? They think people are going to be interested in this. This sort of, backlash is really interesting and it's going to get us readership. So they'll end up going to organizers and saying, hey, people are saying reverse discrimination. What do you have to say? Right? And what they end up doing is that challenge, that criticism, actually provides organizers the space in which to define the message of the event. Okay? It gives them a platform on which to say, listen, it's not an issue of reverse discrimination, it's an issue of this, this, and this, right? We want to create safe spaces for women. We want people to start having discussions about what it means to be a woman walking down the street. So, in conclusion, and I have a lot of things I'd like to talk about. I'm going to highlight a number of, just a few of these. Okay, so questions of should and how men participate in sexual assault protests are at the heart of larger debates about feminist boundaries. The Slut Walk is really great at bringing in numbers. These are large events. They get a lot of press. Right, so we looked at Take Back the Night newspapers from articles from the 1980s onward, and while there were plenty of them, there were also almost equally as almost as equal the number of Slut Walk articles, which within the last few years really tells us something about the interest in the Slut Walk. So it's a non-threatening protest. And so lots of people come, they feel free to express themselves in different ways. However, what happens is that there ends up being sort of a various foci, right? The message of the event becomes muddled. Is it about women's right to dress how they want without being sexually assaulted? Is it about the safety of those people who are genderqueer on the streets? Is it about men's victimization and experiences as survivors? Is it about highlighting, the responsibilities of men? What is this event about? And so the message becomes more muddled than it does with Take Back the Night. So as organizers are increasingly navigating issues of separatism and inclusion in organizing these sorts of events, they consider, women's voices. How do we keep women's voices at the center? How do we keep the focuses on women's experiences and rights? How do we bring perpetrators into the discussion? How do we move past this passive voice? And how do we create allies, right? These sorts of movements need allies. They need support for the cause. And how do we bring in men while not being afraid to offend them, right? Are we only able to bring men into these sorts of events if we're very careful not to offend them? And I would argue, not wanting to offend men is a little bit of a problem, right? Because it tiptoes around the role of men as a group in sexual assault. Okay, so what I end up telling my students when I talk about these sorts of things is that I ask students, I say, what's the first thing you do when you get into a car? And I'll ask, okay, men, what's the first thing you do when you get into a car? And they look at me like, put on the seatbelt, I start the car, it'd be good to start the car. Now when I ask women, okay, women, what's the first thing you do when you get into the car? Oftentimes they say, I lock the doors. Okay, so why are they locking the doors? Are they locking the doors because they think Joe or Brian or some particular man is going to attack them? No, they're afraid of men as a group. Okay, men symbolically represent a group threat to women's bodies. So moving past this idea of blaming men, moving past this idea that men are individually to be blamed, but instead talking about larger structures that encourage men to be complicit maybe in sexual assault or misogyny, right? So if some friend says something really offensive, right, being silent about it, that's sort of complicity in sexual assault. So finally, I encourage us to think about the histories of Take Back the Night and Slut Walk and the reason these marches tend to look different. I encourage us to talk about issues of masculine privilege and fragility or reactivity. Why are men so reactive to these issues? And then also to bring in a conversation of race, sexuality, and class. Okay, so this discussion of bringing men into feminist protests mirrors conversations about what it means to be white in civil rights movements, what are the role, if any, of whites when talking about civil rights, and what are the roles of straight identified people in the LGBT movement, okay? What does participation look like? How is their participation being organized? How might it be a problem? When is it a problem? When is it maybe supporting the privilege or the white guilt, right, of people rather than the larger sort of messages? And then also I wanted to note that Slut Walk has been criticized by Black feminist scholars. It's been criticized as engaging white middle-class experiences of sexual assault, okay, and saying that because women of color have a different history and a different relationship to sexism, right, a raced relationship to sexism, that the idea of reclaiming the word slut means something different, okay? White middle-class women have been called out as having the privilege to take to the streets and reclaim slut, okay? So when we start looking at these sorts of events, we need to look at them through an intersectional perspective, right? Why do these tend to be white protests? And what might it take to actually create more inclusive events? Thank you.
So we will have a candlelit vigil following this event, but before we do that, we want to open it up to questions and answers. So if you have a question that you might like to direct to Dr. Barber, there's a microphone over here by Siobhan. There's one here. We invite you to come up and direct your question. Would you mind coming up?
Hi, ma'am.
Hi.
My name is Dimitri, and I heard you talking about, you said if the dress women wear, it's not a problem. It's not the problem. And I was a little bit, how would say, offense by it, because I don't understand how you can say that you encourage somewhere that women should wear slut dresses. Like, I think the discussion is more around the dignity of a human being. That's what the discussion needs to be. How do we restore our human values? So when you come to the point, you say, oh, no, it can't be okay for a woman to wear everything and get out of the street. And after she gets raped, is that her fault? I mean, somewhere it's her fault. I'm not encouraging men to rape women. I'm saying the question is not around women or men. It's about how do we restore our human values.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, this idea of values, right? From a sociological perspective, we would say that there are no objective values, right? We create values, cultural values, and that these values are gendered, right? So values about women's modesty, sexual modesty, are gendered in ways that we don't necessarily, see in the United States constraining men's dress, okay? So the idea that there are particular values, gender sociologists are really interested in how the creation of particular values constrain women's bodies in ways they don't constrain men, okay? And in ways that discourage women from walking around freely. And so the idea is not to encourage women to dress as sluts. So I think that's, I mean, a great comment. But to, one, bring attention to the fact that women who are sexually assaulted are generally not dressed in provocative ways, okay? Women are generally not raped because of something they're wearing, and rape is generally not about sexual desire. It tends to be about issues of power, okay? So recently there was a woman who's a gamer who was reviewing games online, and she received a lot of backlash for being a woman in a predominantly masculine environment, this sort of gaming world. Okay, and men came online and said things like, "You should be raped," right? And these are the things I'm going to do to you if I ever meet you. Okay, so rape, threats of sexual assault, and sexual assault is a way to control people and reinforce gender divisions, okay, or punish women for crossing gender boundaries. And when we use, slut rhetoric, it's a fallback. It's a it's a way to talk about sexual assault that reduces it to women's appearances when that's usually not the case. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. I have two questions based on race. One is, in terms of the white participants in these slut walks and movements, are they in solidarity, or do you see actively working with movements of massive women in Africa and the Middle East being raped in comparison? And two, what is the breakdown of white men to black men who are actively involved in being allies of this, and how does that race affect that piece as well? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I'll take the second first. Largely, representation of men at these marches, the men tend to be white. And the events themselves tend to be white, okay? And this really represents the sort of entitlement, this feeling of being free to take to the streets, right? This idea that you can freely take to the streets and there won't necessarily be a repercussion. It's this idea of sort of trading on white privilege. But there are really wonderful gender scholars. I'm thinking of Tal Peretz, who went to Atlanta and hung out and spent time with and interviewed men who were participating in what he calls, although the men don't necessarily identify as such, but he says are really feminist-minded organizations, Muslim men organizations, and organizations that are black men only. And the ways in which these men come together along racial and ethnic lines to talk about issues within their community that relate to the subordination of women. So what's interesting is that these sorts of conversations appear to be taking place in more sort of private organizations than on the streets. And I think it really says something about this issue of white privilege and the history of whites feeling free to be in public and to announce their issues. And then, I'm sorry, remind me of the first?
The women that are participating in these movements, where is their solidarity with women being raped in Africa, the Sudan, Middle East, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I can talk too much to the effect of, what's going behind the scenes. What I can say is that Take Back the Night tends to be an institutionalized march that takes place on an annual basis. Okay, it's been taking place since the 70s. The same sorts of on-campus organizations tend to create the events, and so they look similar year after year. And so because they're institutionalized and on college campuses, they're more likely to have relationships with other organizations on campus. So at SIU, for example, we have Black student alliances, we have LGBT organizations that do come together around certain events, but they're institutionalized. Now, take the Slut Walk, however, I'd be really surprised if it ends up with a institutional memory. Okay, let's not forget, it just started in 2011. Because it's organized largely by random people, it's not rooted or tied to an organization, it tends to be maybe a graduate student or a student organizing these events, and then those students graduate. Okay, so we've seen, one in 2011 and then another one in that, city until 2013, something like that, because it's not tied to anything. And because it's not tied to an organization, it's less likely to be in dialogue with other rights organizations. And it takes place almost sporadically and via social media rather than in person. So it's, show up at, in this place at this time, and this is what we're doing. And that, that and then engagement with the media tends to be, right now, the extent of that participation. Does that answer your question? But it's really good stuff to think about.
Anyone else? We'll take one more.
I heard you talk about white and black all night long. I don't know who do you consider white?
Almost everybody at the slut walk. I'm not sure. I mean, so for generally these are white young women who are have been going to college, and they're I'm not talking about European immigrants or anything like that. These are generally sort of long time Americans, I guess.
That's my question. How do you define the white woman?
The same way.
What way? That's what I don't understand.
As non-immigrant whites.
Non-immigrants white.
Right.
All right. So
Yes.
this only deals with non-immigrant whites and non-immigrant blacks.
Yes, and that's, really what we haven't gotten into yet in this point that you raised, and what we hope to get into is really a cross-national analysis that takes ethnicity and immigration into consideration, and we just haven't done that research yet. I'd be really surprised to see a lot of diversity at something like the Slut Walk. But what's interesting is that because the Slut Walk has taken place around the world, there is an opportunity to do a cross-cultural analysis, but we haven't done it yet. But it's going to mean looking globally, not locally. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you come up to the microphone to ask your question?
So off of something he said, what do you think about, what do you think about the sexualization of black women? Like, when you talk about the slut walk, you said it's not a lot of black females in there, and you think that goes hand in hand with each other?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not because black women aren't experiencing sexual assault. It's not because they're not being called sluts, right? But what black feminist scholars mean when they talk about black women having a different history is that, historically we've talked about white women and white sexuality in a way where we sort of, as a nation, want to preserve or protect white sort of modesty. But black women, they say, have been historically hypersexualized. Okay, I see you nodding, right? And that research has been done that says, okay, historically we've hypersexualized black women. We can think of people like Sarah Bartman, right? Otherwise known as the Hottentot Venus, which is a problematic term, who was used or put on display and moved around Western Europe and then later the United States to on display for scientists, almost as part of a freak show, to come and say, look at these different sorts of sexualized features, look at, the size of her butt, or look at her lips, and this is an inferior sexualized body, okay? And it was used to really uplift or make white women's bodies and white women's sort of heterosexualized bodies hegemonic or valued. Okay, and so Black feminist scholars suggest that this different history means that women of different races and different ethnicities are going to have different relationships to the term slut, right? And if we think, you know, internationally, right, if we look on a global scale, women might not be called sluts, but they might be called something else, right? That there's sort of a global phenomenon that constrains women's expressions of sexuality, and this looks different in different countries. And so they say, you know, when we talk about things like the slut walk, we need to consider why Black women might not be joining these white women in such huge numbers. And so that's really an empirical question that needs to be discussed more. So I don't necessarily have the answer for it, but I agree that women's experiences are split along the lines of race and ethnicity and immigration status, and so we need to consider how women's participation is more complex. Yeah, thank you.
So if you have other questions, we're going to ask that you perhaps come and speak to Dr. Barber after, because we're going to move on to the vigil portion. If you would like to participate, there will be students as you exit the theater that will help to guide you to where the vigil will be. It'll be outside in the courtyard, and they will have candles and pledges for you along the way. We thank you for coming, and again, we thank you, Dr. Barber, for coming out for a presentation.
According to a stunning fusion investigation, 80% of women and girls crossing into the U.S. by way of Mexico are raped during their journey. While many of these girls are fleeing their homes because of the fears of being sexually assaulted, they are meeting the same fate on their journey to freedom. Rape can be perpetrated by anyone along the way, including guides, fellow immigrants, bandits, or government officials. Sometimes sex is used as a form of payment when women and girls don't have the money to pay rides. The assaults are so common that many women and girls take contraceptives beforehand as preventative measures. What's particularly disconcerting is that these figures may not even represent the full-grown picture. The issue is that these victims are too afraid to come forward, both because of the stigma that's associated with rape and the fact that they fear being sent back home.
I pledge to recognize that non-consensual sex is sexual assault, to identify situations in which sexual assault may occur, to intervene in situations where consent has not and cannot be given, to create an environment in which sexual assault is unacceptable, survivors are supported.